When I was in the Girl Scouts, I had some pretty awesome friends in my troop. Unfortunately, my leader's husband ruined that for all of us. He ruined just about every event, large and small, for me. Mr. D liked to pick on me a lot. If it wasn't me laughing along with everyone else, it was because he didn't like my clothing. He was ultra-conservative and very religious, and once it was because he didn't like how I led the Pledge of Allegiance, Girl Scout pledge, and how I sang This Little Light of Mine at that night's meeting. I usually cried at least once at each event. The thing that caused the disillusion of our troop and finally made all of the other parents realize just how big of a creep Mr. D was happened when I was 12. Our meeting was to have a sleepover that night, and we all had been asked to bring our favorite outfit and our makeup and our hair supplies for a fashion show. Everyone, me most of all, was relaxed more than usual. Mr. D was on a camping trip with his Boy Scouts. We did our usual meeting and badge work, then spread out over the upstairs of the house, changing our clothes in the hallway, on the landing, and 2 or 3 in the bedroom belonging to the scout leader's daughter, also a member of the troop. We did hair and makeup and headed downstairs to show off for each other. After the fashion show, we all changed upstairs once again and swarmed back down to destroy the chips and soda and the pizzas that had just been delivered, stuffed full of tasty junk food. We all settled in for scary storytelling when the biggest horror of the night made an appearance. Mr. D came down the stairs for some pizza. It turned out Mr. D had first canceled his Boy Scout campout for bad weather. He'd been upstairs the whole time, hiding in the dark bedroom, the one whose door stood open the whole time we had been changing our clothes. Half of the girls went home that night, and only 2 ever went back for a meeting after, which basically meant everything we had planned had been canceled. Parents spread the word, and within 2 months, the troop had officially been dissolved. Mr. D, you are a jerk, and as it turns out, a creepy pervert that spied on a bunch of prepubescent girls at their most vulnerable. You ruined something I enjoyed, despite you, and I hope karma gets you big, if she hasn't already. When I was 13 years old, my family had moved to a Girl Scout camp in the PNW. It was beautiful, 50 acres of forest land. My Paul was the ranger. We had just moved into the new house that had been built for us. We had been previously living in a single wide trailer on the property with the 6-person family. So I finally had my own room. The house was a single-story home, and my room was a front corner room. We oddly enough didn't have screens on our windows, but we lived in the middle of the forest, so only thing to worry about was the occasional black bear, which my dogs would scare off. There was an outside office kitty corner to my room, which had a view of my window. It was the end of summer when we finally moved into the new house, and all of the campers had gone home. I remember going to bed that night with my window wide open. I woke up when it was barely light out and saw a bunch of flashing lights outside my window, so I got up and went to the living room to see what was going on. When my Paul saw me, he told me to go back to sleep and not to worry about it. At the time, I thought nothing of it and went back to bed. The next morning, I found out what had happened. My mom had woken up at 4:30 a.m. that morning like every morning, took her morning cup of coffee to the office, and started playing her computer games. Then, one of our dogs started to do a low growl. She looked up and saw a man standing under my bedroom window, just standing, mumbling to himself while looking in. She quickly and quietly called my dad, who was inside of the house. Not 5 seconds later, my dad comes storming out of the house and confronts the man, while my mom called the cops. When confronted, the man said nothing, just kept staring and mumbling. My dad grabs him by the arm and pulls him away from my window. The guy just let him do it. FYI, my dad had a minor in developmental studies and was pretty sure this guy was mentally ill, or he was high. It was dark, he couldn't really tell, but he had led him away to the driveway, still angry as hell, questioning why he was there and who he was. The man said nothing, then just looked around him and said, "Forest." The cops arrived and took him away. It's terrifying because of a few things. One, how long was he there? And two, had he been in my bedroom, in the house at all? I never slept with my window open after that. So there was this really unusually nice and large house at the end of the block in a small town I used to live in. It made me think of a castle with its large eaves and the way it went up on a kind of hill into a woodsy backyard. When I'd ride my bike as a kid, I'd sometimes go up the wrap around drive and look around the backyard. It was rather quiet and isolated, covered in a canopy of trees, and felt more like you were in a forest than just up the block from my house. There was an old open carport in the back along the fence line, and it had this one dated vehicle that looked like it was from the 40s maybe. It was definitely a vintage car, and I think it was covered, or at least dirty, as if it hadn't been used much. The house windows were so dark you couldn't see inside. And when I walked around the edge of the house, I'd find little toys like from the gumball machines or such littered in the debris there. I never stayed very long though, because it felt like someone was watching me, and I would get creeped out and finally leave, riding back to the opposite end of the street and my house. At some point, I joined the Girl Scouts. I was a brownie at the time, and a neighbor girl friend was in the Bluebirds. She was selling candies, and I was selling cookies. Both of us were going around the block together. My mom told me to stay on our street, though, so I went up towards the end and was headed back when she says, "Let's go sell at that house." She points at the one that I mentioned before, and I sort of gawked at her. "Nobody lives there," I said, but she shook her head and grabbed my arm, pulling me towards it. "Yes, they do. Come on." I followed her reluctantly as we got to the porch and up a few steps, and she knocks on the door. I think I was telling her she was crazy to think anyone lived there as we waited. It didn't take long, though, before I heard footsteps and the door open. I was shocked. This old woman answered and greeted us. She seemed to know my friend, but I didn't say much as my friend spoke back, and the lady invited us in to have a snack. I was the kid who would take candy from strangers. I was pretty open to strangers in general, but something about these people freaked me out. There were two others in the house, males about the same age as the woman. I think they were all siblings from what I understood. My friend went inside, urging me to follow. I told them my mother didn't like me going inside with strangers. and I stood with one foot inside the door and one foot on the steps, the two men watching me with an overly friendly smile. One of them was like, "Come on in. We're not strangers. Your friend is in the kitchen and we have cookies." I shook my head and stayed where I was, waiting for my friend to come back. I really felt creeped out for some reason, not sure why, but it was weird when the men laughed at me being so careful, and one of them called me a chicken, clucking and everything. It was really bizarre, but I held my ground and was relieved when my friend came back. The lady and men bid us goodbye, but said I should come in next time. The one guy calling me a chicken again by clucking. They all laughed, but it was really eerie and made me shiver. I don't even recall if I sold anything. Probably not, but I didn't want to be there, so I was happy to go. As we left, my friend looked at me like I was crazy, eating a cookie, I think, from the lady. As we walked back towards our houses, she told me I was stupid and should have gone inside, but I told her they gave me the creeps, plus the fact the inside of their house was dark and heavily curtained. Like, what the fuck? I mean, who keeps their house all shut up like that unless they're hiding something? I ended up telling my mom about the people. She had no idea the house was occupied either. I sort of told her about my explorations, big mistake, but also made sure to tell her I didn't go inside like my friend had. For that, she praised me, but told me not to go back over there ever again, if I could help it. I think she was a little worried about the fact that our neighbor went in the house. I think my friend may have gotten in trouble when my mom asked her mom about it. Better safe than sorry, I guess. I have no idea who those people were or why they were so weird and hiding inside. I never knew what their name was or anything. I think I even recall the one who was calling me chicken, saying he'd seen me looking around their house a few times. That was kind of weird because that made me realize they had been watching me. Being a cop in a small town in Minnesota probably isn't the most exciting career there is, but it's not bad either. It's actually a relatively peaceful and safe line of work compared to being in law enforcement in one of the big cities like New York or LA, for instance, where the action is. There's only around 10,000 people in the town where I live. It's way out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of open farmland, and the only real crime that ever occurs is pretty minor stuff. The occasional rowdy rednecks getting into a fist fight at one of the 3 bars downtown, teenage vandals, petty theft, the odd drunk driver, disorderly conduct here and there, the rare breaking and entering, that sort of thing. The only real serious stuff I've ever had to deal with was a couple of cases of domestic violence and assault and battery, but even that's pretty typical, I guess, and it doesn't happen very often. Well, that's not entirely true. There was this one case that still haunts me, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I've been a police officer for the past 5 years, and this happened in the early spring of 2014. There was only 5 cops on the entire town police force, me, my partner Jerry, Pete, and Vance, who both worked the night patrol, and the police chief plus Karen, an older woman who was a retired librarian, and worked part-time as the dispatcher. It was an overcast, rainy afternoon in late March, early April. Me and Jerry were in our cruiser on a routine patrol around town when Karen's voice came over the radio telling us that there was a possible 1082 in progress. We acknowledged, then changed directions, headed for the Garrity house. I wasn't unduly concerned about the call. I already had a pretty good idea who had made it. Eileen Garrity was an elderly widow who lived in a run-down farmhouse on the outskirts of town. She was probably around 65 or 70 years old and had lived alone since her husband had died of a stroke 3 years before. They had 2 adult children, but they both lived out of town and never visited her. Since her husband's death, she had developed something of a reputation for being eccentric or crazy. She was a shut-in who rarely left her house and had her groceries delivered once a week. Basically a crazy cat lady minus the cats. The reason she was considered crazy was because she had become pretty flaky and paranoid since being widowed, and had called the police department on multiple occasions for everything from hearing intruders moving around her attic to seeing UFOs in her cornfield. There were probably at least a dozen others too. All of her calls turned out to be false alarms, of course. The burglars she claimed were hiding in her attic turned out to be a pair of raccoons that had slipped in under the roof, and the UFOs were probably just flying overhead with the National Guard base 50 miles west. Me, Jerry, Pete, and Vance had all visited her home before, during our respective shifts. We never got frustrated with her or gave her a hard time about it. Usually indulged her, inspecting her house and property to calm her nerves. She'd relax, thank us, we'd leave, and the process would repeat itself in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. Honestly, our infrequent trips to her house were probably the only real highlight of what was a rather dull and unexciting job. When we told the chief about Mrs. Garrity's latest emergency, Bigfoot was sneaking around her yard, or there was a giant anaconda lurking in the basement, he would just shake his head sadly. When Vance and Pete were the ones who had to deal with her, they'd tell us all about her most recent ordeal. When me and Jerry saw them at the end of their shifts and the start of ours, they'd usually smirk in a mean-spirited way, and Pete would twirl his finger next to his temple before they left. Jerry and I felt sorry for the old woman. It couldn't have been easy for her, a frail, nervous, lonely woman living all alone in that old crumbling house with no friends or close family. I suspected she might be getting senile, or maybe entering the early stages of Alzheimer's or dementia. We worried about her living there by herself, almost a mile from the nearest neighbor. If her health suddenly turned bad, or she had an accident and couldn't call for help, well, there wasn't really much we could do about it. A couple of times I looked up the numbers of her daughter and son and tried calling them about possibly placing her in an assisted living home or a mental health facility, but the one time I managed to reach her son, as I was explaining his mother's situation to him, he abruptly told me that he was way too busy at the moment and would call me back, then abruptly ended the call. He never did call me back. From then on, they always happened to be unavailable and never answered any of my voicemails that I left them. So Jerry and I turned onto Turner Road and drove up to Mrs. Garrity's house on the gray, rainy, early spring day, certain that the old woman was just overreacting yet again to something relatively minor, and her imagination was playing tricks on her. She was waiting for us outside on her porch when we pulled up to a stop. I'll never forget how she looked. It shocked me. She'd always been a thin, frail woman the other times we'd been out there, but we hadn't seen her in probably a couple of months. She had changed drastically since then. Now she was gaunt, almost emaciated. Her cheeks were hollow and dark, rings around her bloodshot, sunken eyes. Her gray hair was tangled and didn't look like it had been washed in days, and the dress she was wearing was wrinkled and dirty. Her physical appearance was alarming enough, but there was also something about the way she was staring at both of us with those dark, dull eyes that seemed to look at us, through us, and past us all at once. It reminded me of old photos I had seen of American soldiers in Vietnam, the blank, expressionless, shell-shocked look of someone who had been through more horror than an ordinary person should have to endure. Me and Jerry exchanged a shocked look, then got out and approached the old woman. "What seems to be the trouble, Mrs. Garrity?" "There's something in my house," she told us in a flat, toneless voice. She was shaking slightly, a woman on the verge of a total physical and mental exhaustion. The way she phrased it, "not someone, but something," made me raise my eyebrow. "Well, you just wait here and we'll go and have a look and make sure it's safe," I told her, trying not to sound too patronizing. I looked to Jerry and nodded. We drew our pistols and stepped past Mrs. Garrity, cautiously entering the house. We did a routine sweep of the first floor, guns leveled, then headed upstairs. It only took about 5 minutes to check out the house. We had done it so many times before, we had the layout down pat, and there was no sign of any intruders or evidence of a breaking and entering, but I saw plenty of other things that disturbed me deeply. For one thing, the place was a total mess. The house was already pretty decrepit, but Mrs. Garrity had still taken pride at how clean she kept it, and it had always been spick and span on our early visits. Now dirty dishes were stacked high in the kitchen sink. The counters were dirty, and trash and dirty laundry littered the floors. I also noticed that Mrs. Garrity's pillow and blankets were lying rumbled on the couch in the living room. The surface of the coffee table in front of it was cluttered with half-drunk cups of coffee, open containers of food, a Bible, and a rosary. It looked like she had been eating and sleeping in the living room for some time. When we went upstairs, sure enough, the bed in Mrs. Garrity's room was bare, and the room itself looked like it had been vacant for quite a while. There was also something in the living room that really alarmed me. Leaning in one corner was an old double-barreled shotgun that had probably belonged to her late husband. Jerry picked it up, broke it open, and found 2 spent shells in the chamber. We took one out, sniffed it, then told me the gun had been fired very recently. We also discovered something else bizarre. All the mirrors in Mrs. Garrity's house had been shattered, and every closet door had been boarded shut. The one in the front hall on the first floor had a huge hole blasted in the center of it, smaller holes pitting the splintered wood around it. You didn't need to be Sherlock Holmes to deduce that Mrs. Garrity had fired her husband's shotgun into the door. But why? What the fuck had happened here? Jerry shot me a perplexed, questioning look. I shrugged, clueless and equally baffled. Finished with our inspection of the house, we put away our pistols and turned around to go back outside. Mrs. Garrity was standing in the room behind us, staring at us with that unnerving blank expression. Both of us almost jumped a foot in the air, startled. Neither of us had heard her enter. Jerry regained his composure and flashed a fake, reassuring smile. "We don't see any sign of him, Mrs. Garrity. He must have slipped out the back. You are safe now." She had opened the closet door several times, while the scratching was in progress to get to the bottom of it once and for all. But each time she had grabbed the knob, she had been overwhelmed with a sudden irrational sense of unease and had been unable to do it. The scratching sounded too deliberate, too gentle, and too deceptively harmless, as if something was trying to lure her into opening the closet door. To be safe, she had started locking the closet door at night. Over the next several nights, the scratching had gotten louder and more urgent, as if something was trying to tunnel its way through the wood. One day, she opened her closet door and found claw marks on the other side. Claw marks that were 6 feet off the ground. Claw marks that looked like they had been made by fingernails. Jerry and I were silent for some time, trying to absorb what she had just told us. We looked at each other, deeply troubled by her story. Neither of us actually believed it, of course, but it was obvious the poor woman was deeply disturbed. She was having some kind of nervous breakdown. Maybe her frayed grip on reality had finally snapped, or maybe old age was taking its toll on her mind. One thing was clear: it wasn't safe for her to be alone anymore, especially not here. It was not healthy for her. Hell, for all we knew, maybe her paranoid delusions were the result of some dangerous type of mold that had formed in the house. Jerry and I stepped outside for a moment to talk in private. We both agreed she needed help. She needed to be institutionalized, but for now it was best that she stayed somewhere else. We drove her to a cheap motel in town and checked her in. Her mental state already seemed to have improved in that short amount of time being away from that house. She smiled and told us she couldn't wait to finally get a night of decent sleep without having to worry about that thing banging on the doors. I think mostly she was just glad she wouldn't have to be afraid anymore of whatever supposed entity she was convinced was lurking in her house. Around 4 a.m. the next morning, I was awakened by an urgent phone call from the chief telling me to get over to the motel as soon as possible. He wouldn't say why over the phone, but I already had a hunch it had something to do with Mrs. Garrity. I felt an awful sense of dread as I got dressed. I wondered if it may be she had taken her own life in her motel room after we had left her. When we arrived outside the motel, my fears were confirmed when I saw crime scene tape blocking the door to Mrs. Garrity's room. The chief, along with Jerry and Pete and Vance, were gathered outside, plus a couple of cops from the state police and a pair of detectives from the city. The chief greeted me with a grave expression as I approached. He told me Mrs. Garrity was gone. At first I thought he meant she was dead. Then, seeing the solemn look on his face, he clarified himself. She was literally gone. I looked at him confused. I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before, something that caused a ripple of fear in my heart. The chief was scared. He told me that he did not know what to make of it. People in the neighboring rooms had heard screams and sounds of violence coming from Mrs. Garrity's room around 2 a.m. Then nothing. They had called the police department. Pete and Vance had been the first to arrive. They had pounded on the door, but there had been no response. They had forced the door open when they saw what was inside. They had called the chief himself. What did they find? I asked him. Maybe you ought to come see for yourself, he told me, leading me to the doorway and under the crime scene tape. He explained to me that they had found no sign of forced entry and that the door and windows in the motel room had all still been locked from the inside when Pete and Vance showed up. I took a look around, feeling blood cold as ice course through my veins. There was fresh blood splattered around the room, on the walls, the floor, bed, and even the ceiling. The blood-stained bed sheets had been ripped away from the mattress, as if someone had desperately tried holding on to them as they were pulled out of bed. There were 10 very thin trails of blood on the carpet, leading away from the bed. Trails of blood that had been made by 10 desperate, terrified fingers clawing for purchase as their owner was dragged away. I followed the bloody finger marks across the floor, away from the bed, to where they ended, at the closet. I looked at them, then I looked at the chief. He looked back at me, his face hard and impassive, but fear gleaming in his eyes. I approached the closet. The door was standing open. I stood there, looking for some time. The closet was empty, completely empty. There wasn't even blood on the floor. They never found Mrs. Garrity. Last year on Saturday night, shortly after 1 a.m., I heard someone creep up my staircase. I live in a 2-story home on the 2nd floor. I heard the cracking of the wood steps. I paused my TV show. I listened. I heard it some more. Then I hear a long pause. Nothing. Then I hear my doorbell jiggling. I freak out. I know it is not the woman downstairs because she is gone for the night. I went straight to the door. I have one of those half-glass windows because I live in a tiny town and my upstairs staircase is covered, so technically no one can see me inside unless they are standing right at the door. And even at that, all they can see is part of my doorway into the bedroom and my hallway, nothing more. So I had the light on at the door inside. The outside light was off. So when I went to the door, I couldn't see out of it. I couldn't see who was there. When I showed myself at the door, obviously the doorknob stopped jiggling because I made my presence known. And they could obviously fully see me because the lights were on. I shut the lights off real quick as an attempt to see who was out there, but it took my eyes too long to adjust. And as I shut the lights off, I simultaneously hit the second lock on my door. And that's when the person on the other side of the door started banging on it. I couldn't see who it was, and quite honestly, once the banging started, I bolted, and so did they. So I tried to look out my windows to catch a glimpse of who it could be, but I couldn't see anything. The exit on the staircase is too close to the house for me to have a full view of the 2nd floor, which is a shame. So I called the cops and I filed a report. And all was good in the world. I equipped my home with wall spray hidden in every corner. I did develop major anxiety over it though, like major anxiety. I had never ever been afraid to live alone before this, but I have worked through it for the most part, and have gotten better since this was the last year. I even got a camera that I have at my door that streams to an app on my phone. Ongoing minor issues. In the last couple of months, I have been having issues though. I park in the little lot across the street. The little lot belongs to the church I live next to. However, I am allowed to park there. I keep finding the sides of my license plates completely bent outwards at a 90-degree angle every morning. I know because I put them back in place every day. So the plates are flat because I can't drive around the plates like that. And pretty much every day of the week I go outside to find my plates bent back. I know it's not the wind, and I know it doesn't happen while I'm driving because I check. My dad, however, has convinced me that it could be the car wash. I get my car washed at least once a week or two, and it's the kind where you just pay a machine and sit in your car. so I pushed it back. But then recently I came home to find 3 things on a little shelf I keep outside my door. 2 small crystal balls and a little flower pot with a golden retriever on it. At first I thought, oh, my sister or my grandma probably just left it for me. I texted them back and they both said, no, they didn't leave anything. They both live on my block, so I thought it would be probably for them to just do that, but both of them said it wasn't them. Then my next thought would be that it's my mom. See, anytime my mom gets me stuff, she leaves it on her front sunroom, which she calls porch. So she will always text me a pic of what she got and say, it's here on the porch, get it when you stop by next. In the 1.5 years I've lived in this apartment, she has never left something on my porch. Also, my camera was dead, so I texted her about it, and she didn't answer, which is like her. If it doesn't pertain to her, she doesn't answer. Also, I'm slightly confused about the golden retriever planter because everyone knows I'm a cat person, and that's what everyone who knows me gets me. What happened tonight? Tonight at 1:19 a.m., I was in my bedroom texting my sister when I heard banging on my door again. The lady who lives downstairs is gone for the night again. This exact same thing happened a year ago too. A Saturday night right after 1 a.m. all the lights in my apartment were on, so they knew I was home. If they waited to break in, they could have. If they wanted my valuables, they have 60 hours out of the week, every week, this last year to do so. No, whoever is messing with me just wants to mess with me. I didn't know what to do. My phone was on the other side of the apartment and I couldn't get to it without going past the door. So I told my sister through text messaging on my laptop and she called the cops for me. They arrived and I knew because I saw them searching the property with their flashlights and I met them at the door. I filed a report and noped out of there, and now I am sleeping at my sister's house for the night. But this is seriously freaking me out. Someone is messing with me in a very serious way. They know I'm home. They knew I was up. They know the woman who lives downstairs is gone. They know the camera isn't charged. Coincidentally, these things keep happening when my camera isn't charged, which takes hours to do so, and I am so paranoid of leaving something charged while I am asleep and not at home. That makes literally no goddamn sense. I don't have enemies in this area. I don't really know anyone in this town except for my coworker or two, my landlord, and my family, who is new to the area as well. I don't have any ex-boyfriends trying to scare me. I haven't fought with anyone who is trying to get revenge on me. But I should mention that about 9 or 10 years ago, I did have a bit of a stalker situation. A 55-year-old man who lived adjacent to my job. He came in every day for a year. We never spoke directly or had any conversations. He would leave me notes on my car. The first one that he left me was about a 5-page letter speaking about our compatibility with one another. He mentioned things in the letter I would speak about with other customers in regards to our compatibility. He even mentioned that he believes he could sexually please me. Something along the lines of how I am a special person and he has what it takes. And it's the kind of special that most people don't have what it takes. He would leave me crystal antique hearts on my car. Anyways, I got a restraining order on him. He was no longer allowed to enter my job. He would occasionally stare at me through the cracks in his blinds, and that was about it. Moved out of state, and nothing ever happened of it. So that could be a possibility too. The story that I am about to tell you probably is a lot less scary than many stories, but it's traumatizing to me. This is a few years ago, so I'm sure I've left out some details and events. Please excuse my English. This happened in the summer of 2016 when I was 24 and my husband was 29. We had moved to the European capital and it was a struggle to find a place to live, so we were living about an hour outside the city until the owner decided to sell his apartment and we had to find a new place. We were lucky and found this great apartment right in the middle of the city center. The rent was quite high, and despite the fact that we were trying to save up to buy our own place, we decided it was worth it. The first 2 weeks were awesome. After we had been living in the suburbs for 2 years, we now had everything just outside our building. My office was in walking distance. There was plenty of shops, restaurants, and nightclubs. One evening after work, we were chilling at home watching a movie when we became aware of someone screaming and singing songs with extremely violent Nazi content. We were looking out our window trying to locate the noise, but couldn't exactly figure out where it was coming from, other than from inside the courtyard that was surrounded by several buildings and a lot of apartments. Kinda startled, we both went and opened the door, thinking it was either the police or some neighbors who were also bothered by the absurd singing and screaming. We opened the door, and a man in his late 30s was looking back at us. He was probably about my height, 5'8", a bit chubby and bald, and looked relatively normal. I later learned that this guy had been a quiet, famous child actor and had been in several movies up until his early 20s. Because he didn't look crazy and appeared relatively calm, we figured he was just another neighbor trying to locate the noise. This neighbor lived in the apartment complex next to us. The building was L-shaped, and if we wanted to, we could look directly into his apartment from our windows. He proceeded to then accuse us of filming him through our window, and we were so confused. We had been in our windows a lot this evening trying to locate the commotion, but we never recorded anything, and why would we record his apartment? He now had this crazy look in his eyes and was saying all kinds of crazy shit that I have now forgotten, but it was some kind of insane Nazi conspiracy theory stuff, and we were, of course, sent by someone to come and harm him. That's when we realized that this guy was behind the obscene singing and screaming. As he was getting more and more agitated, he tried to enter our apartment, but my husband shoved him out and closed and locked the door. We heard him walk into his apartment and slam the door. For some days, maybe a week, we didn't hear or see anything of this neighbor, but we did see some strange drug addict type of people coming and going from his apartment. Then the singing and screaming started again, at all times, but especially at night, when we were trying to sleep. We almost went crazy, but because it's so hard to find a place to live in this city, and because we hate moving, we put up with it. Later one afternoon, we smelled something burning and went out in the hallway to try and figure out where it was coming from, and together with another neighbor, we quickly found that it came from the Nazi guy's apartment. We tried knocking, but no one answered. We tried peeking through his mail slot, but saw nothing except for smoke. We obviously called the fire department, who came and knocked down his door to find him sleeping naked with something burning on the stove. They put the small fire out, he apologized, and I don't think anything else came of it. Of course, he continued to sing and scream his Nazi songs and racial stuff about how we were also introduced to wolf howling. It sounded totally crazy. Even with our windows shut, we could still hear him. Some more time passed, and one night, before we were going to bed, my husband felt a burning smell. We immediately suspected that the smell came from his apartment, and we were about to dial the fire department when we heard this loud bang in the country yard. We looked up and could see the Nazi guy throwing out his belongings and furniture from his windows into the courtyard. And not only this, but his apartment was in flames. We were panicking because the hallway was starting to fill with smoke, and we didn't want to die from inhaling the toxic smoke. On our way down from the 3rd floor, we grabbed our stuff and my husband went knocking on all doors to get our neighbors out. No one ever found out why he set the apartment on fire, and together with another neighbor, we came up with the brilliant idea of breaking in to rescue the Nazi guy. They finally managed to knock in the door, cover their faces with some clothing, and went in. They couldn't find the guy and had to give up and run out before there was too much smoke. Shortly after, the fire rescuers came and put out the fire, but they couldn't find anyone else in the Nazi guy's apartment. He went missing for some time until he showed up trying to get into his apartment. The locks had been changed. The police were still investigating. He had actually started the fire and then left his apartment. Apparently, he was trying to burn down the whole building with all the neighbors asleep. He was later charged with arson, but managed to run away and didn't show up in court. We moved away shortly after that, so I'm not sure what happened to this guy, if he ever did time in prison or what, but when I Google his name, it looks as if he's still living in the same apartment. I also found several stories about him online and police reports, so he's obviously a guy with a lot of issues. Too bad he has to involve other innocent people, though. So I was a sophomore in college and was going to the downtown campus of a great university. It's not a very good part of town. The college was making the area safer, but it was only safe for like a block in any direction. So one night, my roommate and I were studying and we decide we need a late night snack. So we go to Circle K. That's like 2 blocks northwest of the dorm building. It's like 12 a.m., so not so smart to start with. Anyway, we were in the store and we grab our snacks and go to pay. There's a line at the counter and I'm chatting happily when I notice my friend get really rigid. I look at her and she looks me in the eyes and slowly shakes her head, basically saying, "Don't say anything," and motions behind us. There are 2 males a bit older than us, so I kind of look and notice that they are staring at both of us. I want to leave and just put the snacks back and leave, but she just kind of stays still. They notice me looking and start talking immediately to each other, which gives me a chance to ask her what's up. She whispers, "I've been listening to them. They're saying, check out that ass, and I want her." So I go pale and start feeling sick because it's dark as hell out in downtown, and this city isn't too safe for young girls out late. We decide to get our stuff and leave as fast as possible. We power walk back to the dorm. As we were walking, I look back and suddenly see that the guys are walking fast towards us. We run across the street without the crosswalk sign because we are so fucking freaked out, and they see that, and it just makes them walk faster. We're getting close to the dorm now. We grab our key cards that are required to get into the dorm after 9 p.m. and run the last few paces, scan the cards, winch the door open and close it hard. We run into the elevators by the security desk and look back. The guys are trying to get in the dorm by pushing on the doors. We tell the security guard what had happened, and he looks and says they are gone. He didn't really care though, So we go up to our dorm, all shaken, and by chance, I look out my window down at the street, and there they are, walking around and around the building. We watched until they were gone. We definitely didn't go out that late, or even to the Circle K again. In the spring of 2005, I was driving from Maryland to Florida for some major conference. I'd left my friend's house in Richmond in the wee hours of the morning and had stopped around 5 a.m. in North Carolina to fill up the tank and empty another one. I had just gotten back into my car and turned it on when there was a knock on the passenger side window outside. There was an older woman in her 50s. I locked the doors and cracked the window just enough to hear them tell me that she needed a ride. Just a few exits back up I-95. I kept repeating that I wasn't headed that way. She wasn't letting it go, and every hair on my neck was starting to stand up. I thought about going back into the store, but to be honest, I wasn't sure if I would make it to the store, or what situation I would find myself in. Finally, I held my cell phone up and said that if she did not leave me alone, I was going to call the cops. Situation changed completely. She apologized and walked away. I wasn't shaking too much to drive, so I took a few minutes to collect myself before pulling out to go back to the highway. That's when I saw a car pulling out from behind the store. The lights hit it right away, and I was shocked to see it was her behind the wheel. I recovered real quick and pulled out of the station behind her. She made her way back to 95, and I was right behind her. That's how I saw her pull a car she didn't supposedly have on 95 South. The exact opposite direction of where she so desperately wanted to go. I got around her, and as I passed her car, she locked eyes with mine, with a stare that was so incredibly cold. I have chills to this day thinking about it. Since then, no matter what I'm doing or where I am, I never get in the car without locking the doors. I also never ever crack the windows for anyone but a cop. Anyone who approaches my car gets yelled at through the window with my hand on the wheel in case a quick getaway is needed. I used to live in a real rough area. I'm talking a super low-income apartment complex in southeastern Tennessee that had been raided by the drug task force and cleared out multiple times in the past. The apartment complex was pretty spread out, with a lot of roads linking them all together. This place was almost like a small village, I guess, because most people in the complex would wander around outside or sit outside their apartment, and they would just socialize or do shady shit. A lot of small meth labs, dealers, and that sort of thing. They didn't tend to have a lot of problems because of a former addict myself. I didn't tend to be the snitching or moralizing sort. As long as whatever fuckery you were up to didn't impact or involve me, I didn't really give a fuck, as long as nobody was getting actively harmed. So that's who I was. The quiet gay guy who lived with his boyfriend and 4 cats, who didn't fuck with anybody, but on the few incidents I'd be fucked with, I'd been known to not back down, so I wasn't often fucked with. People who also didn't tend to start shit with each other there, mostly just outsiders, and while I didn't make friends, I was at least a known member of the community as I lived there for about 2 years. I did not have the option to move out. I was poor as hell, and between me and my ex, I was the only one working. I was able to keep up with us and the cats fed. and bills paid. But that was literally it, and sometimes I struggled to do that. At least the bills part. Can't say any of us ever went hungry, even if what we were eating was low-grade shit. I drove a shitty, old 2001 Jeep Grand Cherokee at the time. This vehicle was such a piece of shit that every time I got into it and turned the key, I'd pray to God, hoping that this wasn't the day that it finally stopped working. The vehicle had a ton of problems, some of which I managed to fix on my own, others not so much. That said, it was my lifeline, the only way I had to get to work. I'm not quite sure how this happened, but somehow word got around that I was trying to sell my Jeep. This was obviously not true because I needed the damn thing and knew it wasn't worth enough to sell in order to assure I could buy another vehicle. Nonetheless, I started having people approach me about it, offering me painfully low sums of money before I turned them away. I tried my damnedest to kill the for sale rumor, but it persisted up until the day I moved out of state and never looked back. So, one night, toward the end of my tenure at the complex after me and my ex had split and he moved out, I was alone and gaming on my PC. I believe I was playing Tekken. I heard a loud, frantic series of knocks at my front door. These apartments were small and shitty, so it was within visible eyesight of my bed in the bedroom, and this dude was knocking loudly. I get up, already stretched out because of the hour, and grabbed the knife I had and looked through the peephole. I could not really see anything because it was so dark, so I talked through the door. I asked who it was and what they wanted, in a commanding, almost aggressive tone, because I wasn't trying to look vulnerable. For reference, I'm just under 6 foot, around 220 pounds. I'm by no means small or weak. That said, I'm also not a one-man army or some kind of badass. I'm just as human as anyone else, and while I'm not one to run away from a fight, I'm also not the idiotic type to run towards them. I heard nothing at first, so I asked again, nothing again. I stood there, trying to listen for a few minutes before returning to the bedroom, and a few minutes later, I heard the knocking start once again. This time, I went to my window to see if I could see anyone outside at all, and I saw several shadows lurking near my Jeep, parked just outside. Now at this point, I was worried that they were going to try to break into it or steal it, so this time I actually opened the door. Standing in the little alley thing in front of my door was a group of 3 individuals. I only recognized one, who was standing in front of the other 2. I'd seen him around the complex and knew he lived there. I'm still packing the knife, but I'm not brandishing it at this point. I asked again what he wants and what the hell these people are doing knocking on my door at 1 a.m. and lingering around my Jeep. He said he heard it was for sale and he wanted to buy it, offering me the pitiful amount of money he had on him, legit, like $30 for it, and said him and his boys were just checking it out. I told him, look man, the Jeep isn't for sale. I don't know what the fuck you heard. And even if the Jeep was for sale, I wouldn't sell it to you for $30 fucking dollars. Now please, get the fuck off my property. After this, he gestured for his buddies to come over, and now I had 3 people standing shoulder to shoulder in the hallway leading up to my door, doing their best to intimidate me, before the guy asked, in a real fucked up tone, "You sure about that, boy?" Before I said, "Yeah, the fuck I am." After which I revealed the knife and ejected the blade from the handle. This was a larger knife with full brass knuckle guards and spike at the bottom of them. Not your typical small pocket knife by any means. His response to this was to call me a pussy for bringing out a weapon, to which I responded something along the lines of, "Says the motherfucker who comes here 3 deep," to which he just laughed at me. The sight of the knife did not put him off at all. I guess he figured I'd be too scared to use it, and that they could rush me before I got the chance. When I saw them inching their way forward, I sprung into action and started wildly thrusting and slashing the blade around in their general direction with wild abandonment, showing I had zero issues with potentially killing or injuring all of them. I knew I was not likely to win a 3-on-1 fight, even with a knife, but I made it goddamn clear that if I was going down, I was taking at least one of them with me. They backed up and started spewing shit talk at me, including calling me a faggot and other choice words. I was known to be gay, even if most people act surprised when I tell them. I kept moving towards them as they backed up, showing that at this point they either were going to leave or someone was going to get stabbed. By the time I got to the end of the hallway to the lot where my Jeep was parked, I noticed 2 more people standing by the Jeep and internally swore at myself for just not going back inside. But I was in too deep now. At this point, I went all in and started yelling at the top of my lungs, acting like a bloodthirsty lunatic who was just out to hurt people in a similar manner to how people try to scare bears away. I was just trying to be as loud and as threatening as possible to really sell the idea that even if they took me out, at least one of them might end up dead as a result. And to be honest, I fully intended for it to go that way if the shit popped off. One of the guys by my Jeeps then brandished what looked to be a piece of wood at me as a threat, to which I responded, "Come at me with that stick and I'll slit your goddamn throat, you stupid motherfucker." I remember saying this very well because one of the other guys thought it was the funniest shit in the world and started laughing, not in a "you won't do it" sort of way, but in a manner that seemed like I was genuinely entertaining him. I was so hyped on adrenaline, my response to this was to slash at him, as he was one of the closer ones to me, at which he swore at me before running off, and all the rest followed suit. After this, I went back inside and stayed awake until sunrise to make sure that they did not come back, before finally falling asleep on the couch by the door so I could hear if anything else happened outside and hopefully wake up if it did. Nothing more happened, and the next day after, I saw the guy who initialized the standoff with me as I was getting home from work. He followed me up to my apartment where I parked and apologized for what had happened. He said he was high at the time and also drunk, so he was feeling extra stupid. I told him not to fucking do it again. He then quickly approached me and hugged me in this real bro sort of way. I went along with it and told him to have a nice day before going back inside and settling down. I had no more incidences with him and his buddies ever again after this. Even though I played it off as not caring, it was mostly just to avoid further conflict. So, to the whacked out meth head and his friends who decided it was all in their best interest to intimidate me into selling my vehicle